The dust-covered wagon rolled into Fort McKinney with the weight of tragedy clinging to its wooden sides. 6-year-old Little Dove sat motionless in the back, her dark eyes vacant as the Wyoming frontier stretched endlessly around her. The Apache girl hadn't spoken since the cavalry raid that killed her mother 3 weeks ago, and she hadn't eaten in 4 days. "She's wasting away," muttered Sergeant Morrison to his wife Catherine as they watched the wagon approach. "Doc says if she doesn't eat soon, she won't make it through the week." Catherine Morrison, the fort's unofficial caretaker for displaced children, had seen her share of broken souls. But something about this small Apache girl, wrapped in a torn blanket and staring at nothing, struck her differently. Perhaps it was the way Little Dove's thin frame seemed to disappear into herself, or how her silence carried the weight of a world that had crumbled around her. The wagon stopped in front of the Morrison quarters, and Private Johnson climbed down, his uniform dusty from the long journey. "Found her hiding in the rocks near the massacre site," he reported quietly. "Hasn't made a sound since we brought her in. The other survivors said her mother was killed trying to protect her." Catherine approached the wagon slowly, her calloused hands steady despite the turmoil in her heart. Little Dove's eyes tracked her movement but remained empty, like looking into a dried well. The child's buckskin dress was torn and stained, her long black hair tangled with grief and dust. "Hello, little one," Catherine said softly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had raised 7 children of her own. "I'm Catherine. You're safe now." The girl's breathing remained shallow, and Catherine could see the sharp outline of her ribs through the thin fabric. 4 days without food, and the child seemed determined to join her mother in whatever realm awaited beyond this harsh frontier. "I know you can't understand all my words," Catherine continued, settling beside the wagon. "But I lost my mother too. I was about your age when the consumption took her back in Missouri." For the first time, Little Dove's eyes focused, just slightly, on Catherine's face. "I stopped eating then too," Catherine admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thought if I could just disappear, maybe the pain would go with me. But my grandmother, she was Apache like you. She told me something I never forgot." The wind picked up across the plains, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of horses. Catherine reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small beaded bracelet, worn leather with blue and white beads that had seen decades of wear. "This was my grandmother's," Catherine said, holding it where Little Dove could see. "She said that when someone we love dies, their spirit doesn't leave us. It lives in our bodies, in our breath, in our heartbeat. But if we stop eating, if we stop living, their spirit dies too." Little Dove's fingers moved slightly against the wagon's wooden side, the first voluntary movement she'd made in days. "She told me that to honor the dead we must feed the living parts of them that stay with us," Catherine continued. "Your mother's love, her hopes for you, her dreams of who you might become, they're all still alive inside you. But they need strength to survive." The child's breathing changed, becoming deeper, more present. Catherine could see the internal struggle playing out across her young features, the desperate need for connection warring with the guilt of wanting anything in a world without her mother. "I think your mother's spirit is hungry," Catherine whispered, "and it's been waiting for you to feed it." Above them, the vast Wyoming sky stretched endlessly, and for the first time in weeks, Little Dove blinked back tears instead of staring into nothing. The next morning brought Yellow Hawk, an elderly Apache scout who worked with the cavalry, to the Morrison quarters. He carried a small leather pouch filled with dried berries and nuts, traditional Apache trail food that had sustained his people for generations. "The child needs to remember who she is," he said to Catherine in his careful English. "White man's food will not speak to her spirit. She needs the taste of her people." Catherine nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words. She had learned much about Apache customs from her grandmother's stories, and she knew that food was more than sustenance. It was identity, culture, and connection to ancestors. In the small room where Little Dove lay on a narrow cot, the child remained curled in the same position, though Catherine noticed her eyes seemed more alert. The army surgeon had insisted on keeping her under observation, but his clinical approach had done nothing to reach the girl's wounded soul. "Little Dove," Catherine said, settling beside the cot, "Yellow Hawk has brought something for you, something your mother would have given you." The old scout entered quietly, his weathered face creased with concern. He had lost his own daughter to a cavalry raid years ago, and he recognized the particular brand of grief that came from violence and loss. He sat cross-legged on the floor, the traditional way, and opened the leather pouch. "These berries," he said in Apache, his voice carrying the cadence of ancient stories, "they grow where your mother walked. They hold the memory of her footsteps." Little Dove's eyes darted between Catherine and Yellowhawk, conflict playing across her features. Catherine watched the internal battle, the desperate need for connection, warring with the guilt of wanting anything in a world without her mother. "I know it hurts," Yellowhawk continued, switching to English so Catherine could understand. "When I lost my daughter, I thought eating was betrayal, but the ancestors whispered to me in dreams. They said, 'The dead do not need food, but they need the living to carry their stories.'" The old scout held up a single dried berry, its dark skin wrinkled but still holding the essence of the high country where it had grown. "Your mother picked berries like this. She taught you which ones were safe, which ones were sweet. That knowledge lives in your hands now." Little Dove's fingers trembled against the blanket, and Catherine noticed her lips part slightly. The first sign of physical hunger she'd shown in days. "If you eat," Yellowhawk said gently, "you keep alive the part of her that knew how to survive. If you starve, you kill the wisdom she died protecting." The room fell silent except for the distant sounds of the fort, horses nickering, men calling orders, the eternal wind across the plains. Catherine held her breath, knowing they were witnessing a moment that would determine whether this child lived or died. Slowly, so slowly it seemed like a prayer, Little Dove's hand emerged from under the blanket. Her thin fingers reached toward the berry, trembling with effort and emotion. "That's it, little one," Catherine whispered. "Your mother's love is hungry too." The child's fingers touched the berry, and for a moment she simply held it, as if weighing the decision to continue living. Then, with a movement that seemed to require all her strength, she brought it to her lips. The first bite was tiny, tentative, but it was enough. The familiar taste seemed to awaken something in Little Dove's eyes. Not happiness, but recognition. She was still Apache. She was still her mother's daughter. Yellowhawk smiled, the first genuine expression of hope Catherine had seen from him. "Good," he said simply. "Now you can begin to live for both of you." Outside the window, the Wyoming mountains rose like ancient guardians, and for the first time since the massacre, Little Dove swallowed, instead of refusing the world. 3 days had passed since Little Dove's first bite, and while she had begun eating small amounts, she still hadn't spoken. Catherine found herself spending hours beside the child's cot, sharing stories in a mixture of English and the Apache phrases her grandmother had taught her years ago. "You remind me of myself at your age," Catherine said as she mended a small dress that would fit Little Dove better than the oversized clothes the fort had provided. "After my mother died, I used to sit by her grave and pretend she was just sleeping. I'd bring her favorite wildflowers and tell her about my day." Little Dove watched Catherine's skilled hands work the needle, her dark eyes tracking each careful stitch. The child had shown interest in handwork, and Catherine had noticed her fingers moving as if remembering how to braid or weave. "My grandmother found me there one evening," Catherine continued, her voice carrying the weight of memory. "I was 7, and I'd been sitting in the cemetery for hours talking to the headstone. She didn't scold me or tell me to come home. Instead, she sat down beside me in the dirt." The needle paused in Catherine's hands as she remembered that pivotal moment. She said, "Catherine, your mother isn't in that ground. She's in the way you laugh, the way you hum when you're thinking, the way you care for wounded animals. If you want to visit her, look in a mirror." Little Dove's breathing changed, becoming more attentive. Catherine could see the child processing not just the words, but the shared experience of loss. "But I was angry," Catherine admitted. "I told my grandmother that if my mother was alive inside me, why did it hurt so much? Why did I feel so empty?" The afternoon sun slanted through the small window, casting long shadows across the rough wooden floor. Catherine set down her sewing and looked directly at Little Dove. "You know what she told me?" Catherine's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She said, "Because love doesn't die, but it has to find a new home. The pain you feel is love with nowhere to go." For the first time since her arrival, Little Dove's eyes filled with tears. Not the vacant stare of trauma, but the active grief of someone beginning to process loss. I think that's what's happening to you, Catherine said gently. All that love you had for your mother, it's still there. But it doesn't know where to live now. It's making you sick because it's trapped inside with no way out. The child's small hand moved to her chest, pressing against her heart as if she could feel the weight of unexpressed love Catherine described. My grandmother taught me that the Apache way is to let love flow like water, Catherine continued. When someone dies, their love doesn't disappear. It joins the great river of all love that came before, but we have to open our hearts to let it flow through us to others. Little Dove's lips moved silently, as if she was trying to remember how to speak. She showed me how to make a memory bundle, Catherine said, reaching into her apron pocket. She pulled out a small leather pouch, worn smooth by years of handling. Every time I missed my mother, instead of holding the pain inside, I would put something in here, a flower she liked, a smooth stone, a piece of fabric from her dress. The child's eyes focused intently on the pouch, and Catherine could see her mind working, connecting this ritual to Apache customs she might have seen her own mother perform. But the most important thing, Catherine said, untying the pouch and showing Little Dove the collection of small objects inside, was that every time I put something in, I had to tell someone a story about my mother. I had to let her love flow out of me and into the world. Little Dove's hand reached out tentatively, not quite touching the pouch but close enough to feel the energy it contained. That's how I learned that grief isn't something you get over, Catherine explained. It's something you carry forward. It becomes part of your strength, part of who you are meant to be. The child's mouth moved again, and this time, Catherine caught the faintest whisper of sound. Not words yet, but the beginning of a voice finding its way back to life. Would you like to make a memory bundle for your mother? Catherine asked softly. Little Dove nodded, the first clear communication she had made since arriving at the fort. Her tears flowed freely now, but they were cleansing tears, not the dry grief of someone who had forgotten how to feel. Outside, the bugle sounded evening call, and Catherine knew they had crossed some invisible bridge. The child was ready to begin carrying her mother's love forward instead of letting it die with her. A week after Little Dove's first nod, Catherine found her sitting by the window, working on a small beaded bracelet with materials Yellow Hawk had brought from the trading post. The child's fingers moved with the muscle memory of skills her mother had taught her, and Catherine could see the concentration in her young face. That's beautiful work, Catherine said, settling beside her. Your mother taught you well. Little Dove looked up, and for the first time Catherine saw something other than grief in her eyes, a flicker of pride, quickly followed by guilt. It's okay to be proud of what she taught you, Catherine said gently. That's how we keep the best parts of people alive. The child's fingers stilled on the beadwork and Catherine waited, sensing that words were fighting their way to the surface. Little Dove's voice was barely a whisper, rusty from disuse. She said I had gentle hands. Catherine's heart leaped at the sound of the child's voice, but she kept her expression calm, not wanting to overwhelm this fragile moment. She was right, Catherine said simply. I can see it in your work. Tell me about learning to bead. Little Dove's fingers resumed their careful work, and Catherine noticed that talking seemed to help her concentrate. Every morning before the sun, she would say, Little Dove, today we make something beautiful. Today we make something that will last. The child's English was accented but clear, and Catherine realized she had been understanding far more than she had let on during her silent weeks. We would sit outside our lodge, Little Dove continued, her voice growing slightly stronger. She would tell stories while we worked, stories about our ancestors, about the animals, about the spirits in the mountains. Catherine watched the child's face transform as she spoke. The vacant stare was replaced by animation, by the natural expressiveness of a storyteller's daughter. What was your favorite story? Catherine asked. Little Dove's hands paused again, and Catherine saw the familiar conflict cross her features, the desire to share warring with the guilt of experiencing joy. It's okay, Catherine said softly. Stories don't die when the storyteller does. They live in the people who heard them. If you don't tell your mother's stories, who will? The child considered this, her dark eyes serious beyond her years. She told me about the first little dove, she said finally. My great-grandmother. She lived when the buffalo were thick as clouds on the plains. Catherine nodded encouragingly, and Little Dove's voice grew stronger as she continued. The first Little Dove could speak to animals. When the hunters came back empty-handed, she would go to the buffalo and ask them to give themselves to feed the people. She would promise them that their spirits would be honored, that their sacrifice would be remembered. The child's beadwork resumed, her fingers moving in rhythm with her words. Catherine realized this was more than conversation. It was healing, the act of carrying forward the stories that had shaped her identity. One winter was very hard, Little Dove continued. The buffalo had gone far away and the people were starving. The first Little Dove went alone into the mountains to find them. She walked for many days, eating only snow and tree bark. Catherine found herself leaning forward, caught up in the tale despite the tragic circumstances of its telling. She found the buffalo chief in a high meadow, Little Dove said, her voice taking on the cadence of traditional storytelling. He was huge with horns like the crescent moon. She told him about the children who were crying from hunger, about the old ones who were too weak to walk. The child's eyes were bright now, fully present in the story. Catherine could see her mother in the way she gestured, in the rhythm of her speech. The buffalo chief was moved by her words. He said, "Little Dove, you have a heart bigger than your body. We will come, but you must promise me something. Promise that when you have daughters, you will teach them to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves." Little Dove's voice faltered slightly, and Catherine realized the story had brought her to a painful recognition. "She promised," the child whispered, "and my great-grandmother kept that promise, and my grandmother kept it. And my mother?" Her voice broke. "My mother was teaching me to keep it too." Catherine reached out and gently covered the child's busy hands with her own. "And now you know why you have to live," she said softly. "Not just for yourself, not just for your mother, but for all the promises that came before you." Little Dove looked up, tears streaming down her face, but her eyes were no longer vacant. They were full of purpose, of understanding, of the terrible and beautiful weight of carrying forward a legacy. "I have to tell the stories," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "I have to keep the promises." Catherine nodded, her own throat tight with emotion. "Yes, little one, you do. And that's why you have to eat, why you have to grow strong, why you have to let yourself heal. The stories are depending on you." Outside, the wind carried the scent of sage and the distant sound of horses, but inside the small room a child had found her voice again, and with it, her reason to live. 2 weeks after Little Dove had spoken her first words, Catherine noticed the child watching the other children at the fort, with a mixture of longing and fear. The colonel's son, Timothy, and several other army children played near the well, their laughter carrying across the dusty parade ground. Little Dove would position herself at the window, observing their games, but never approaching. "They seem like they're having fun," Catherine observed, joining Little Dove at the window. The child nodded but didn't move from her post. "They don't know my stories," she said quietly. "They don't know Apache ways." Catherine understood. Little Dove was caught between worlds, too Apache for the white children to fully accept, too surrounded by army life to maintain her traditional connections. It was a loneliness that Catherine recognized from her own childhood, when her mixed heritage had made her an outsider in both communities. "You know," Catherine said, "when I was your age I felt the same way. My Apache grandmother's stories seemed too strange to share with the other children in Missouri. But then I learned something important." Little Dove looked up with interest. "I learned that good stories are like good food. They taste different to everyone, but they nourish everyone who hears them." That afternoon, Catherine arranged for Little Dove to join the other children for their daily lessons. The fort's makeshift schoolhouse was just a corner of the supply building, with rough wooden benches and a slate board that had seen better days. Mrs. Patterson, the sergeant's wife who served as teacher, had been briefed on Little Dove's situation. "Children," Mrs. Patterson announced, "we have a new student today. This is Little Dove, and she has some wonderful stories to share with us." Timothy, a freckled boy about Little Dove's age, raised his hand. "Is she really Apache? My pa says Apache are fierce warriors." Little Dove shrank back slightly, but Catherine, who had positioned herself nearby, caught her eye and nodded encouragingly. Apache are many things, Little Dove said, her voice barely above a whisper. We are warriors when we need to be, but we are also storytellers and healers and makers of beautiful things. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the beaded bracelet she had been working on. The children leaned forward to see the intricate pattern of blue and white beads. My mother taught me this pattern, Little Dove said, her voice growing stronger. It tells the story of the sky and the clouds. Each bead has meaning. Sarah, a girl with blonde braids, raised her hand. Can you teach us? Little Dove looked surprised. You want to learn Apache beadwork? Yes, several children chorused. Catherine watched with growing pride as Little Dove began to explain the significance of colors and patterns in Apache crafts. The child's natural gift for storytelling emerged as she described not just the techniques, but the cultural meaning behind each design. Blue beads represent the sky where the spirits of our ancestors live, Little Dove explained, holding up her work. White beads are for the clouds that carry their messages to us. When we wear these patterns, we remember that we are never alone. Timothy raised his hand again. Do you know any stories about the ancestors? Little Dove's eyes lit up. Many stories. Would you like to hear about the first Little Dove? As the children gathered closer, Catherine saw something remarkable happening. Little Dove was no longer the broken child who had arrived at the fort. She was becoming a bridge between worlds, sharing her culture while learning to navigate this new environment. The first Little Dove could speak to animals, she began, settling into the traditional storytelling posture her mother had taught her. This was long ago, when the buffalo were as thick as clouds on the plains. The white children listened with rapt attention, their earlier wariness replaced by genuine fascination. Catherine realized that Little Dove's stories were doing more than entertaining. They were building understanding, creating connections across cultural divides. After the lesson, as the children dispersed for their afternoon chores, Timothy approached Little Dove shyly. That was the best story I ever heard, he said. Do you know any more? Little Dove smiled, the first genuine smile Catherine had seen from her. I know many more. My mother said that a good storyteller never runs out of stories. Will you tell us another one tomorrow? Sarah asked, bouncing on her toes with excitement. Little Dove nodded, and Catherine could see the child's posture straightening with newfound purpose. She was no longer just surviving, she was beginning to thrive. That evening, as Catherine helped Little Dove prepare for bed, the child looked up at her with serious eyes. Catherine, she said, I think I understand now why I had to live. Oh? Why is that? Because the stories need someone to carry them forward. And maybe the white children need to hear Apache stories too. Maybe that's how we build bridges instead of walls. Catherine hugged the child close, marveling at the wisdom that grief and healing had brought to someone so young. I think you're right, little one. I think you're exactly right. Outside, the vast Wyoming sky stretched endlessly above them, and Catherine knew that Little Dove had found her place in this new world, not by forgetting who she was, but by sharing it with others. 6 months had passed since Little Dove's arrival at Fort McKinney, and the transformation was remarkable. The silent, starving child had become the fort's most beloved storyteller, gathering children and adults alike for her evening tales. Her English had improved dramatically, though she still spoke with the lyrical cadence that marked her Apache heritage. Catherine watched from the doorway as Little Dove led a group of children in making traditional Apache dolls from corn husks and scraps of fabric. The child's hands moved with confidence now, her voice clear and strong as she explained each step. The doll is not just for playing, Little Dove instructed, helping young Sarah wrap the corn husk in a small piece of calico. She is a keeper of stories. When you hold her, you remember the hands that made her, the love that went into her creation. Timothy, now one of Little Dove's closest friends, raised his hand. Will you tell us again about your mother teaching you to make dolls? Little Dove's expression grew thoughtful, but Catherine noticed there was no longer the sharp pain that had once accompanied any mention of her mother. Instead, there was a gentle sadness mixed with gratitude. My mother's hands were very skilled, Little Dove said, demonstrating how to tie the corn husk to form a head. She would say that when we make something beautiful, we put a piece of our spirit into it. That's why handmade things are more precious than store-bought things. Is that why you put so much care into everything you make? asked Mrs. Patterson, who had become one of Little Dove's strongest supporters. Yes, Little Dove replied, because I carry my mother's spirit now and my grandmother's and all the women who came before me. When I make something beautiful, I honor them all. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. The child had not only survived her devastating loss but had transformed it into something that enriched the entire community. The fort's children had learned more about Apache culture in 6 months than most Army families learned in years of frontier service. That evening, as Catherine helped Little Dove prepare for bed, the child pulled out a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. I want to show you something, she said, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a collection of small objects: a smooth stone, a pressed flower, a piece of beadwork, and a small carving of a dove. My memory bundle, Little Dove explained, like you taught me to make, but I added something new. She held up the carved dove, its wings spread as if in flight. Yellowhawk helped me carve this. It's not just for remembering my mother anymore. It's for carrying her love forward. Catherine examined the small carving, marveling at the skilled workmanship. It's beautiful, little one. What does it mean to you? It means that love doesn't die, Little Dove said, echoing the words Catherine had spoken to her months ago. It just finds new ways to fly. My mother's love lives in the stories I tell, in the children I teach, in the bridges I build between our peoples. The child carefully rewrapped the bundle, but Catherine noticed she held it differently now, not as a desperate clutch at the past, but as a treasure to be carried forward into the future. Catherine, Little Dove said, settling under her blankets, I want to tell you something important. What is it? When I first came here, I thought dying would be easier than living without my mother, but now I understand that dying would have been the easiest thing I could do. Living, really living, that's the hard thing, that's the brave thing. Catherine felt her breath catch. What changed your mind? You did, Little Dove said simply. You showed me that your mother's love didn't die with her. It lived in how you cared for me, how you knew exactly what I needed to hear. And Yellowhawk showed me that the ancestors live in our actions, our choices, our willingness to carry forward their wisdom. The child's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but they were tears of gratitude, not grief. I think my mother sent me to you, Little Dove continued, because she knew I would need someone who understood that love doesn't end with death. It just changes form. You taught me that I could honor her best by living, not by dying. Catherine leaned down and kissed the child's forehead. And you taught me that sometimes the broken pieces of ourselves can become the foundation for something even stronger. You've made this whole fort better just by being yourself. As Catherine prepared to leave, Little Dove called out softly, Catherine, tomorrow I want to start teaching the children how to make memory bundles. I think everyone should know how to carry love forward. That sounds like a wonderful idea, Catherine replied. Your mother would be very proud. I know, Little Dove said, her voice peaceful. I can feel her pride inside me. It's warm, like sunlight. Catherine blew out the lamp and quietly closed the door. Outside, the Wyoming stars shone with brilliant intensity, and she knew that somewhere in that vast sky, a Apache mother's spirit was indeed proud of the daughter who had chosen to live, to love, and to carry forward the light that could never be extinguished. The next morning would bring new stories, new lessons, new opportunities to build bridges between worlds. But for now, in the gentle darkness of a frontier fort, a child slept peacefully, surrounded by love that death could not touch, and dreams that honored both the past and the future. Little Dove had learned the greatest lesson of all, that the best way to honor those we've lost is not to join them in death, but to carry their love forward into life, sharing it with others until it multiplies beyond measure. In doing so, we ensure that love never truly dies. It just finds new hearts to call home.